They said she would never last, that the first carrier to face Japan's fury would go down like the rest, a few months, maybe a year, before the ocean claimed her. But the shipyard workers in Newport News had built her differently. They hammered her plates tight, sealed her decks with faith more than rivets, and gave her a name that whispered destiny. Enterprise. To the men who walked her decks, she wasn't just a carrier, she was a promise. When the Pacific burned at Pearl Harbor, she was at sea. Fortune or fate had spared her. She returned days later, her flight deck littered with returning scouts, the harbor still smoking, battleships lying broken in the mud. In that moment, the Enterprise became something more than steel. She became the spearhead of vengeance. Her pilots were young, most barely past 20. They had learned to fly on farmland airstrips, and now they carried the weight of a wounded nation. The ship's engines rumbled like a heartbeat as she turned west, into the empty blue, chasing an enemy that seemed untouchable. The men on deck spoke little. They cleaned the guns, fueled the planes, checked every cable twice. They didn't talk about revenge, they just prepared for it. The first months were chaos. The Japanese fleet ruled the Pacific, its flag planted across half an ocean. The Enterprise hunted in the shadows, hit, vanish, strike again. At dawn, her decks glowed orange beneath the rising sun. At dusk, she vanished into storms that swallowed her whole. She became a ghost ship, always reported sunk, always returning from the dead. To the Japanese, she was a myth. To the Americans, she was hope given form. In May 1942, she joined the Hornet to strike the Marshalls and Wake. Tiny islands fell beneath her bombers, proving that the enemy could bleed. Her Wildcats clawed through zeros, learning the hard way that courage alone wasn't enough. Every loss was written into the deck logs, every name read aloud at sunset. The men kept going because the ocean gave them no other choice. Then came the whispers, Midway, a place barely visible on the map, but one the Japanese meant to seize. Every available carrier was ordered north. The Enterprise steamed through nights lit only by red lamps, her crew working in silence, engines thrumming like distant thunder. They didn't know it yet, but they were sailing towards the battle that would decide the war's direction. On the morning of June 4th, 1942, her flight deck trembled under the weight of history. Dozens of dauntless dive bombers lined the planks, engines coughing to life. Pilots strapped in, faces pale beneath goggles. Some carried photographs tucked under flight suits, wives, children, a dog in the yard. The chaplain walked the line, offering a prayer drowned by propeller wash. Then came the signal flag. Launch. The first Dauntless rolled forward, tail hook rattling, and leapt into the sky. One by one they followed, rising into clouds that promised death or glory. For hours the radios crackled with fragments, bearings, enemy sightings, a static silence. Then suddenly, words that froze every man at his station. Enemy carriers sighted. Commencing attack. Over the horizon, beyond the curve of the sea, Enterprise's pilots found the Japanese fleet. 4 carriers, veterans of Pearl Harbor, lay below: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu. The enemy owned the sky. Their fighters clawed upward, but the Dauntlesses kept diving, throttles open, wind screaming. From 20,000 feet they fell like stones, releasing bombs at the last heartbeat before impact. When the explosions came, they shook the sea. Fire leapt skyward, black and red curling into thunderheads. One carrier after another vanished in flame. By noon the tide of war had turned. Enterprise's squadrons returned low on fuel, some riddled with holes, others never returning at all. On the flight deck, mechanics waved the survivors in, dragging men from cockpits too weak to stand. The air smelled of oil and victory. That night the horizon glowed with burning ships. Midway was saved. The Japanese Navy had lost its striking arm, and the Enterprise had written herself into legend. But she would not rest. The Pacific still stretched vast and cruel, and new battles waited beyond every sunrise. Her hull bore scars from shrapnel. Her decks were patched with whatever the crew could find. Yet she sailed on, her name painted larger now, her legend carried in whispers through every mess hall from Pearl to Perth. In August she turned south toward the Solomon Islands, Guadalcanal. A new campaign, a new hell. The Marines had landed, but Japan was coming to take the island back. The Enterprise was their only shield. Each day her planes launched into storms thick with gunfire, diving through tracer webs to protect the men fighting in the jungle below. The air stank of cordite and salt, The ocean was stained with oil and fire. Pilots returned with 1,000-yard stares, hands shaking as they climbed from cockpits. They had watched friends fall flaming into the sea, yet they went again the next morning, because that was the rule. As long as the Enterprise floated, she fought. By September, the strain began to show. The enemy hit back again and again. Bombers came at dawn, shadows against the sun. One morning, they broke through. A dive bomber plunged from the clouds, engines screaming, and dropped its payload squarely on the flight deck. The explosion tore steel like paper. Flames rolled across the deck, men vanished in the smoke. For hours, the crew fought the fire with bare hands and hoses. When the last ember died, the ship listed, blackened but alive. A destroyer captain watching from afar sent a signal. "Is the Enterprise still afloat?" The reply came back simple, yes. That night, under the stars, sailors walked her deck in silence. They had lost friends, but they had kept the ship. From then on, she earned a new name whispered by both sides, the Grey Ghost. Because no matter how many times Japan claimed to have sunk her, she always came back, and she would come back again. The fires of Guadalcanal left their mark on everyone. The smell of burned paint never truly left the ship. She limped back to Pearl Harbor under her own power, smoke still curling from the seams, her crew sleeping wherever there was air that didn't sting. Shipyard workers met her with quiet awe. The welders ran their fingers over the torn steel as though feeling the pulse of something still alive. They said the metal hummed, faint but steady, like a heartbeat refusing to stop. For weeks, sparks rained over her decks while plates were replaced, guns remounted, wires strung anew. Men who had never seen combat treated her like a living veteran. When she sailed again, fresh paint gleaming beneath Pacific sun, sailors along the pier saluted. No one doubted her anymore. She was the Enterprise, the ship that would not die. The next call came soon, Santa Cruz. The Japanese fleet was striking again, desperate to turn the tide around the Solomons. The Enterprise steamed south with Hornet beside her. On October the 26th, 1942, before dawn had even painted the sky, her radar screens lit up with ghosts that soon became planes. The first attack wave arrived out of the glare of the rising sun. Lookouts screamed, klaxons wailed, and gunners swung their barrels upward. Bombs splashed close as geysers of white water drenching the crew. Then one hit home. A bomb crashed through the flight deck near the forward elevator and exploded deep inside. The deck buckled, fire burst from every seam. Men ran into the smoke with hoses, hauling wounded comrades clear. Fuel burned along the catwalks in blue sheets. Someone shouted to jettison armed planes before they cooked off. Others simply kicked them overboard. The second wave came minutes later, torpedo bombers sliding low over the waves. Anti-aircraft guns barked red fury. Some attackers disintegrated mid-dive, others got through. One torpedo struck near the stern, rocking the ship like a hammer blow. The sea poured through ruptured seams, yet the pumps held. By mid-afternoon the air was thick with cordite and steam, but the Enterprise was still afloat. When the Hornet went down that evening, the Enterprise became the last American carrier left in the Pacific, the lone sword. Her crew patched the deck with timber and canvas, and kept launching planes until darkness made it impossible to tell friend from foe. That night, exhausted men sat among shell casings and silent guns, staring at stars half hidden by smoke. They were too tired to celebrate, too stubborn to surrender. In Tokyo, radio announcers declared the Enterprise destroyed. Sailors on board heard the broadcast through static and laughed. "They'll never get it right," one gunner muttered. "She doesn't sink, she just smokes a little." Weeks later, she was back at Pearl Harbor, patched again, restocked, and sent right back into the storm. Every return to port was shorter than the last. The men stopped counting repairs and started counting ghosts. The chaplain's list grew longer, names written in block letters that never faded fast enough. Yet replacements came. Farm boys from Kansas, machinists from Detroit, kids who had only seen the ocean on postcards. Within days they moved like veterans, because on the Enterprise there was no room to be new for long. By 1943 the United States was advancing. Island by island, the Pacific narrowed. Each new base meant more range, more raids, more long nights under red battle lights. The Enterprise led them all, Gilberts, Marshalls, Truk. Her bombers struck at shipping lanes. Her fighters tangled with Zeros until the sea itself seemed made of flame. She was no longer a ghost. She was the storm itself. Sailors began to say she could feel the enemy before the lookout saw them. Radar men swore the screens glowed differently when Japanese planes approached. Superstition took root, part fear, part faith. They called her the Lucky E, half joking, half believing. Every time she came home, more riddled, more scarred, the legend deepened. Then came 1944, the great turning of the tide, the invasion of the Marianas, the battle that would shatter Japanese naval air power once and for all, the Philippine Sea. On the morning of June 19th, the Enterprise launched wave after wave of fighters into a sky already filled with contrails. Hundreds of Japanese planes approached in tight groups, their silver bellies glinting like fish scales. American pilots dove into them, radios bursting with calm, clipped words. Tally-ho! Break left. He's on fire. From the deck, the crew watched through binoculars as distant dots merged and vanished in blossoms of flame. The gunners below had nothing to shoot at. The killing happened far beyond their reach. The Japanese called it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The Enterprise called it Revenge Served Clean. By sunset, the sea was littered with oil and wings. Only a handful of enemy planes made it back to their carriers. The Enterprise's pilots returned singing through the radio static, voices hoarse, engines sputtering. The war's balance had shifted again, and she had been at its centre. That night, the officers gathered in the ready room. The air was thick with sweat and fuel. No one made speeches. Someone simply said, "Tomorrow we launch again." And they did. Months blurred together. Saipan, Tinian, Guam. Each name another scar carved into the hull. The ship's log read like a heartbeat. Sorties launched, casualties, repairs, sorties launched again. The ocean swallowed everything else. Then came Leyte Gulf, the largest naval battle in history. 4 engagements across hundreds of miles, thousands of ships, each clash louder than the last. The Enterprise was everywhere at once, launching strikes against battleships, rescuing pilots from burning seas, refueling destroyers mid-fight. Her flight deck never cooled. Planes landed with bullet holes, were refueled, rearmed, and hurled back into the sky within minutes. Mechanics worked with rags tied over their mouths, coughing black soot. The guns never stopped talking. On October 25th, 1944, kamikazes found her. The first slammed into the deck near the island, exploding in a storm of metal and blood. Fire consumed the forward catwalk. Men beat at it with extinguishers and bare hands. Minutes later another came, diving straight through smoke into the same wound. The blast tore open compartments below, the deck peeled upward like a blister. Dozens died where they stood. Still the crew saved her again. Within days, temporary repairs let her launch aircraft once more. The enemy could not comprehend it. Reports from Japanese pilots spoke of a ship hit 5-6 times, yet always back the next week. They began calling her the unsinkable phantom. By winter, her decks were patched with steel from other ships, her hull scarred and dented, her elevators groaning with every lift. But she kept fighting, through typhoons and ambushes, through sleepless nights when even the stars seemed tired. The crew joked that she was held together by coffee and prayer. Deep down, they knew it wasn't a joke. She had become more than a vessel. She was the collective will of thousands who refused to yield. The welders who built her, the pilots who died defending her, the sailors who scrubbed her decks under falling shrapnel. Every plate of armour was memory. Every rivet, a name. As 1945 dawned, the Enterprise turned toward Okinawa, the last great battle. None of the men aboard said it aloud, but all knew it would be the hardest yet. Kamikazes came in swarms now, guided by desperation instead of strategy. Radar screens filled with blips until they looked like snowfall. The crew took to sleeping in life jackets, helmets beside their bunks. Even in dreams, they heard the whine of diving engines. When the first attacks came, they came fast. Anti-aircraft guns stitched white fire across the clouds. One kamikaze broke through and struck near the forward elevator, detonating with a sound like the sky itself tearing. The shock threw men from their stations, smoke filled the passageways, water flooded compartments. The carrier slowed, listing slightly to port. But she didn't stop. Within hours the fires were out, and damaged planes were being pushed aside so others could launch. The next day another came, then another. Each time she survived, limping but alive, refusing to sink. Reporters on nearby ships began calling her the ship Japan couldn't kill. The name stuck. That night the wind shifted and the ocean calmed. The crew gathered on the darkened flight deck, watching lightning flicker on the horizon. Somewhere out there the enemy was still coming, but for a moment the world was quiet. They leaned against the scorched railing, eyes red from smoke, and listened to the waves tapping the hull. A few whispered prayers, others just breathed. The Enterprise floated between storm and peace, a monument of endurance. She had been hit by bombs, torpedoes, and suicide planes. She had buried more men than most towns, yet she had never once turned back. As long as there was sky above and sea beneath, she would fight. And still the hardest test was yet to come. Dawn at Okinawa was the colour of steel. The sky and the sea were the same shade of grey, and the line between them seemed to dissolve. On the flight deck the crew moved like ghosts, their faces drawn thin by months of battle. They had stopped counting the days. There was only before the last attack and after the next one. The Enterprise steamed in the outer ring of the fleet, her deck patched again with new steel still dark from the welding torch. The smell of burned paint clung to the air. Planes were lined wing to wing, fuel hoses running like veins across the planks. At first light, the ship's bell rang once, not for ceremony, but for rhythm. The engines below answered, a deep, steady vibration that travelled through every bolt and bone. The men said it felt like the ship's heart waking. Radar picked up the first wave just after sunrise. They came in low and fast, handful of dots turning into dozens. The air raid alarm wailed, echoing down the passageways. Gunners sprinted to stations, helmets clattering, hands trembling on cold steel. The sky filled with black bursts of flak. Tracers arced upward, the sound of the ship becoming a single roar. Engines, guns, men shouting, range and bearing. A kamikaze slipped through the chaos, diving from the sun. The gunners caught him late. A 5-inch shell hit the wing but didn't stop him. He struck near the forward elevator, exploding with a flash so bright that men on the bridge saw nothing for seconds. The blast ripped open the flight deck, hurled wreckage across the bow. Flames climbed 30 feet high. In the hangar below, aircraft fuel caught fire, the heat turning the air to glass. Damage control parties fought through smoke so thick they crawled to breathe. Fire hoses hissed, ammunition cooked off in dull pops like distant drums. The captain never left the bridge. He barked orders calmly, his voice steady, almost detached. Below him the crew moved as one organism. They sealed compartments, dragged hoses, carried the wounded to the fantail where medics waited under tarps. For hours they fought the fire, and when it was done they were blackened and bleeding, but the engine still turned. She would live again. They called it the worst hit since Santa Cruz. Reporters later wrote that any other ship would have sunk. The Enterprise stayed in line and kept launching planes until the last of her undamaged fighters were gone. Only then did she withdraw. For the first time in years, she headed not for another fight but for home. She reached Leyte Atoll a week later, smoke still curling from her sides. The sailors who came aboard to assess the damage stood in silence. The once smooth deck was a cratered ruin. The forward elevator twisted into a shape no engineer could explain. The ship was tired. Every plate and beam said so, but she was alive. She had survived 18 major battles and 20 attacks that should have ended her. When the crew learned she would be sent stateside for repairs, no one cheered. They simply nodded, as if the ocean itself had granted permission to rest. The voyage east was quiet. The sea was calm, the weather merciful. Men stood at the rails for hours watching the horizon, trying to remember what silence felt like. As they neared Pearl Harbor, tugs and small boats came out to meet them. Every whistle in the harbour blew as she entered. Workers lined the docks, saluting. They had seen her leave before, scorched, battered, impossible, and every time she came back. This time she moved slower, her grey paint streaked with rust, her name barely visible through the smoke stains. But the flag still flew, and that was enough. Repairs began, but the war was nearly over. In the shipyard the men worked without hurry, aware that history was catching up to them. News came that the fleet had reached Japan's doorstep, that new carriers, younger, larger, faster, now filled the sea. The Enterprise had done her part. She would not sail again before the end. In August, the bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. When the surrender was announced, sailors still aboard the Enterprise gathered on her weathered deck. Some cheered, others wept. A few simply looked at the horizon, unsure what to feel. For years the ocean had been their world. Now peace felt like a kind of emptiness. The ship that had fought from the first days to the last watched the dawn rise over a world she had helped reshape. The Pacific was quiet again, broken only by the slow slap of water against her hull. She had earned her rest. In the years that followed, they called her the Grey Ghost of the Pacific. She had earned 20 battle stars, more than any other American warship. Every medal, every citation, was paid for with names carved into stone. The Navy retired her in 1947, stored her in cold berths, and for a time there was talk of preserving her as a museum. The money never came. The world was moving too fast for ghosts. In 1958, the order went out. Enterprise CV-6 to be scrapped. The news spread quietly among the veterans who had served aboard her. Some wrote letters, others gathered in bars and raised glasses to absent friends. They knew nothing could truly erase what she had been. A ship is steel, but legend is not. When the cutters came, they worked fast. Plates that had once felt the heat of battle fell one by one. The great ship vanished not with an explosion, but with the slow hiss of torches. Yet those who had stood on her deck swore they could still hear the engines, faint and steady, somewhere beneath the sound of sparks. Years passed. The world changed. Jet aircraft screamed where propellers once roared. The ocean filled with carriers twice her size. But at reunions across the country, old sailors still wore small pins shaped like twin stacks and a flight deck stretching into infinity. When they spoke of her, they did so softly, as if she were listening. They told stories of Midway, of Guadalcanal, of the night the deck glowed red and they thought she would finally go under. They spoke of the smell of cordite and hot steel, of the way the sea misted the rails at dawn. They remembered her sound, that deep vibration that travelled through everything. Some said they could still feel it when trains passed at night, that low rumble that meant she was still out there somewhere. A generation later, a new Enterprise took to the sea, a nuclear carrier, vast and gleaming, carrying the same name in black letters across her stern. When she launched, surviving veterans were invited to watch. They stood at the pier, caps in hand, eyes reflecting the sunlight off the new hull. The admiral beside them spoke of progress, of legacy, but the old men saw something else. A continuation, a heartbeat that refused to die. The new ship's engine started with a low hum that rose to a roar. The veterans nodded. One of them whispered, "She's back." And maybe, in a way, she was. Because a name can carry more than letters. Sometimes it carries memory. Sometimes it carries the weight of every man who refused to surrender. The Enterprise CV-6 had been that kind of name. One forged in fire and endurance. One that told the story of what a nation can build when it refuses to yield. She had been scarred, burned, broken, and patched more times than anyone could count. She had been declared sunk, lost, destroyed, only to reappear on the horizon again and again. And through it all she had carried the same flag, the same stubborn will to keep going. They called her unsinkable. They called her the Grey Ghost. But the men who served aboard her knew what she really was. She was America. Tested, scarred and unbroken. They say the ocean never forgets. Long after ships are gone, their wakes linger just beneath the surface. Invisible but present, moving with the tides. Somewhere beneath the Pacific sun, in the vast quiet between Hawaii and Japan, the ghosts of that great ship still drift, their outlines drawn in salt and memory. For decades after the war, fishermen swore they saw her. A grey silhouette on the horizon at dusk. No lights, no flag. Just a shape gliding through the mist before fading away. When they reported it, the Navy always said the same thing, impossible. But the men who had once walked her decks never doubted. They believed she was out there, keeping station, watching over the ocean and she had once ruled. At memorials and at reunions, the stories always began the same way, quietly with the clink of coffee cups or the slow pour of whiskey. Someone would mention the first time they heard the general quarters alarm, the way the metal seemed to shiver before the guns began to speak. Another would recall the smell of the hangar after a strike, burnt oil, cordite, and victory. They would fall silent for a moment, each hearing his own ghosts. Then someone would smile and say, "She always came back." The table would nod. That was enough. In time, the faces changed, the hair turned white, the hands that once tightened bolts and throttles now trembled when lifting a glass. But when they spoke of her, their voices steadied. Because for them, the Enterprise had never been just steel and rivets. She was a companion, a guardian, a symbol of everything they had survived. One pilot remembered the day at Midway when the sea was burning. He had come in on fumes, instruments dead, canopy cracked. When the flight deck appeared through the smoke, he felt tears under his goggles. "I didn't see a ship," he said. "I saw home." The others at the reunion nodded. They understood. In the Navy's archives, the photographs tell their own truth. Men in flight gear grinning beside scarred planes. Sailors sleeping on the deck between missions. Smoke curling from the island tower as the sun set behind her. In one image, the deck crew stands waist-deep in foam, fire hoses spraying, a world of chaos around them. If you look closely, you can see the determination in their faces, tired, soot-blackened, but unbroken. That single frame holds the spirit of the Enterprise, a refusal to yield. When historians write about the Second World War, they list statistics: tonnage sunk, sorties flown, miles steamed. But numbers cannot capture the heartbeat of a ship. They cannot explain how a vessel becomes a legend. The Enterprise did it by endurance alone. Every time she was struck, she rose again. Every time her decks burned, men rebuilt them before dawn. She became proof that courage could be welded into metal, that faith could be measured in knots and gunfire. She fought in every major Pacific engagement from 1941 to 1945. She sank or helped sink 71 enemy ships, destroyed hundreds of aircraft, and survived more direct hits than any carrier in history. She carried 10,000 men through hell and brought most of them home. And when the war ended, she was the only pre-war carrier still standing. The last survivor of the First Fleet. The grey ghost of a vanished world. After her scrapping, small pieces were saved. Sections of deck, bits of rail, the ship's bell, a handful of nameplates. They ended up in museums, veterans' halls, even on living room mantels. To outsiders, they were just relics. To those who knew, they were fragments of something eternal. Each carried a hum, a faint vibration that seemed to whisper in quiet rooms when the wind blew off the ocean. In 1961, when the new Enterprise, the first nuclear carrier, was commissioned, a small box was carried aboard. Inside was a piece of her predecessor's flight deck, polished smooth. It was bolted beneath the captain's chair on the bridge. No plaque marked it, but every commanding officer knew it was there. A link between eras, between men who flew propellers of oars and men who flew supersonic jets. The heartbeat continued. Generations later, filmmakers, historians and dreamers would tell her story again. They would show the black and white footage of planes lifting off, the deck crews waving them into the sky, the anti-aircraft guns hammering smoke into the clouds. They would narrate her battles, Midway, Santa Cruz, the Philippine Sea, with reverence. But the truest part could never be filmed. The silence afterward, the way the ocean held its breath when she returned to port. Every nation has its legends. Some are written in words, others in steel. The Enterprise was both. She began as a machine and ended as a myth, a testament to what ordinary people can do when the world gives them no choice but to fight. Her legacy isn't measured in victories but in persistence, the belief that survival itself can be a form of triumph. If you stand today at the water's edge at Pearl Harbor and close your eyes, you might hear it. The low rumble of engines beneath the wind, the faint clang of a deck bell lost to time. You might imagine the horizon glowing faintly, as if the past were still out there just beyond sight. And maybe, just maybe, you'll feel that she never truly left. That somewhere, beyond the reach of maps, the Enterprise still sails on. Because legends don't end, they echo. The Enterprise CV-6 was more than a warship. She was a nation's resilience made visible, a reminder that courage does not sink, that hope does not burn, and that the human spirit, when tested, can become as enduring as the sea itself. They said Japan would sink her. They said no ship could survive that many battles. They said she was finished again and again. But every time the grey ghost rose from the smoke, and though her hull is gone, her story still cuts across the water like a wake that refuses to fade. She is out there somewhere. The ocean remembers. The Enterprise sails on.